Hello, and welcome to Wrestling and Everything, Coast to Coast, with your hosts, Buddy Sotello and Evan Ginzburg. Evan, why don't you introduce our special guest today?
All right. We have right here from Pro Wrestling Frequently Asked Questions, FAQ. Brian Solomon is a former editor and writer for WWE, having worked on such publications as WWE, Raw, and SmackDown during his 7-year tenure with the company. Solomon is the author of the book WWE Legends and has also contributed to Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and I believe Brian is doing radio with Pro Wrestling Illustrated now also. And he's also done books on Godzilla, and he's working on the original Sheik, not the Iron Sheik, the original Sheik book. So all my Detroit guys are excited about that. And we are honored to have my buddy Brian Solomon. How are you, Brian?
I'm doing great, Evan, buddy. Thank you guys for having me on the show. I mean, I'm doing as great as can be right now. Let's just put it that way. So,
it's been a rough stretch for everybody here in New York. We're in the epicenter. I was out with my wife doing errands before, like Bonnie and Clyde with the mask and the, covered from head to toe. So, it's not easy, But on a brighter note, Brian, you have a ton of projects always. Tell us what you're working on now.
Yeah, I know. It seems like I have a little more time to work on them, too, so that's kind of a blessing. I've been doing more with Pro Wrestling Illustrated than ever before. So I've got the cover story on the brand new August issue that's coming out any day now, the WrestleMania story. I'm the co-host of their podcast, the PWI podcast. I'm doing video editorials, and they're going to be giving me a regular column in every issue going forward. It's going to be called The Lockup. So I got that going on. I've got the Sheik book that you just mentioned, which I'm like waist deep in now. It's going to be called Blood and Fire, the unbelievable true story of wrestling's original Sheik. So those are two big things that I've got going on right now.
Wow, that's really incredible. We had Kenny Casanova on last week, and he told us a lot about his process of how it was to write a book and how difficult it was. You've done both the wrestling FAQ book, and now you're working on this one. Can you tell us how the challenges are to put a book like that together?
Which one, the Pro Wrestling FAQ?
Or the Sheik book, the one what you're working on with the Sheik?
Well, I'd never done a biography before, so that's a whole different animal, because most of the books I've done before are kind of like reference books, where it's just general research and gathering a lot of information together. This is different because it's kind of telling one person's specific story. And so I'm just super, super serious about getting all the facts straight, because I'm telling the story of a man's life, and I don't want to, put something in there that's not true or that is, perceived as negative for no reason and that kind of thing. So I'm really conscious of that stuff. And I'm just trying to get the story right. I mean, there's never been a biography done on Ed Farhat, the original Sheik. And I'm finding that part of the reason I think for that is it's a hard story to tell because he protected his private life so well that I feel like I'm like Indiana Jones trying to dig up all this information about his real life. And what's the fact and what's the fiction? It's kind of making me a little nuts, and I want to make sure I get it right. So that's my biggest challenge.
How are you finding the sources for a guy who has been dead for a number of years? How are you able to find sources that are credible and that help illuminate the situation?
That's another challenge because so many of the primary people are no longer with us. Sheik's been gone for 17 years. Bobo Brazil is long gone. Most of the major players of big-time wrestling, Pampero Firpo, who was somebody I was trying to land an interview with, passed away during the process of trying to get an interview. I was talking to his daughter. So, I mean, I've been lucky. There's still like Flying Fred Curry still around. He was incredibly valuable. I've talked to people that were kind of just breaking in at the time who are still around, like Kevin Sullivan, who's like, he worshipped the Sheik. I talked to Al Snow. I've talked to Rob Van Dam. People like that who definitely were in his circle, but just kind of later in life. It's a shame that most of the people that were there kind of at the beginning and in the heyday of it are not around anymore. So I have precious firsthand stuff, and then there's a lot of kind of secondhand stuff that you have to wade through to figure out what's the BS and what's not.
Do you think there are a lot of younger fans that are interested in hearing the story of the Sheik, or is it more older fans that want to reminisce about the older days?
Well, I mean, you can't help but there's no avoiding the fact that obviously the biggest part of the audience are going to be people that remembered the Sheik. But part of what I'm trying to do is keep his name alive and keep his legend alive for younger people that take an interest like me. I mean, I didn't start watching wrestling until the late 80s, but I took an interest in all this stuff that happened before that. I was just fascinated by it. So I'm hoping that more people like that will want to learn about this guy, because part of it is, like Evan, you mentioned how when you kind of alluded to the fact that nowadays when you say Sheik, the first thing people think of is the Iron Sheik, which, I mean, nothing against him, but I'm trying to kind of re-educate readers into thinking, well, look, I mean, nothing against the Iron Sheik, but Ed Farhat, the Sheik, was a much bigger draw. He was much more famous in his time. He was a main eventer everywhere he went. He was a legendary heel at a level that most heels never get to. And so I think he deserves his due, because the recognition of his name has faded, as happens with any, legend of a bygone era. And I'm kind of working to fight against that in a way.
I'll tell you a funny Sheik story. I was in the dressing room in the early 90s. He worked in Indy in Philly. He worked several times for Joe Goodhart. And he walks into the dressing room, and you have all of these quote-unquote journalists, historians, insiders, and he was an old guy at the time, and everybody looked at him with like fear in their eyes because he had this gravitas, and same thing when he came out to wrestle that night. These were quote-unquote smart fans. He came out, they were scared of this guy. He just had like this psycho persona when he came down the aisle, and people were like withdrawing when he came near them. It was wild. And I saw him wrestle Abdullah, and it was great. It was great, yeah.
Well, Tommy Dreamer, who's another person I interviewed for this, he told me the story of going to Sabu's wedding, and the Sheik, of course, was there. He's his uncle, and it was like the Sheik was almost treated like he was like the Godfather or something like that.
Yeah.
It really was like he was wearing, like three-piece suit, rings on every finger, and everybody was in awe of him. Al Snow told me about how even a lot of guys, when they broke into the business, even were still afraid of him in the locker room, even though they were in the business. They still had heard so many rumors like, oh, he's going to cut you, or he's going to do this. You never know what he's going to do. And, he created that persona so well, and he protected it so fiercely that it's like it's hard to penetrate through. Now that I'm writing this book, it's been my biggest challenge.
Johnny Valiant looked at him as a mentor and loved him. And I know Dave Drayson Brzezinski out in the Detroit area managed him and also speaks highly of him. And guys like Mark Boujan, the historians in the Detroit area, these are guys you really have to speak to. Mark Nowatarski did a documentary on the Sheik.
Yeah,
So,
I've spoken to them all. Yeah, Dave especially. Dave has so many great stories. I mean, he was really close, and he knew Joyce, his wife, and he had been in there in the office of Big Time Wrestling. He was really close to a lot of it. He was very helpful, actually, and he's got photographs too, amazing photographs.
if either of your wives are vacuuming right now, you need to put her in the camel clutch because we have background noise here.
Yeah, it's true. I hear it as well. No, my kids are running around. Even though I told them to sit still, they're still running around, but no vacuums.
Yeah,
I'm the only one in this house who vacuums.
I'm barricaded in the basement here, so there's absolutely no noise here. So I don't know.
Maybe it's just a tech glitch because I was hearing it pretty solid for a few minutes.
I was going to blame you guys. So
It's better now. It's better.
But that's the loveliness of having to do all this stuff from home. I wanted to know, when you made your wrestling FAQ book, what motivated you to make that book, and what were your ideas of what you wanted to convey when you put that book together?
Well, that was a book that was very special to me because, I worked in the wrestling business for a few years in the corporate side of it. I was at the Titan Tower for 7 years, and I was kind of known during that time as being this walking encyclopedia of wrestling. And people always told me, you should write a book one day all about wrestling, just the history of it, everything about it. People just kept telling me that. And so I saw it as this task that I was like destined to fulfill, And so about 5 years ago, I guess it was 5 or 6 years ago, I had a friend of mine named Mike Edison. I don't know if you know him, Evan. I think
I went to one of his shows one night.
Yeah.
I met him. We're not close or anything, but I know him. Yeah.
Right. I think it was the same night that I first met you. He was an editor for Wrestling's Main Event magazine back in the 80s, and he's a big wrestling guy, and he happened to be working for this publishing company that was doing the FAQ series, and they wanted to do a wrestling one, and he was going to take it on himself, but he said, you know what, I know a guy, and I was the guy, and he reached out to me, and he said, you're the one, you have to do this book. And so I just put my heart and soul into it. At the time I wrote it, I was not working full time. I was actually student teaching. I was studying to become a high school teacher. And so I actually had a lot of free time because I would be getting home relatively early in the day, and some days of the week I wasn't working at all. So I was able to put that book together in maybe 6 months, which is something I would never be able to do now with other things I have going on. But I really put my heart into that book. That was a labor of love. For sure.
What do you feel was your favorite question to answer, and what was your least favorite question to have to answer?
Well, the part that I enjoyed the most is more than just a question. It was really kind of doing the history portion of the book, because the first few chapters are strictly just devoted to history, starting from the Civil War right up to the present. And I just was, because I feel like no one's really ever done that justice before, so it was important to me to get it right. And so that was the most fun. The part that I kind of was the most skittish about, just because I'm not the kind of person that likes to badmouth people or kind of put negative stuff out there, but there's a chapter in the book that's all about the scandals of wrestling. It's sort of like that Dark Side of the Ring TV series they have now, except in book form. I was kind of ahead of my time, but I had like the Jimmy Snuka stuff in there, Benoit, Owen Hart, Bruiser Brody, that kind of stuff. And, I felt like it was important in a book like that. You can't just gloss over things. But by the same token, I just felt, it's in my nature to not want to rustle people's feathers, I guess, in a way. So I had mixed feelings about that, doing that chapter.
As a journalist, what is your take on Dark Side of the Ring?
I am enjoying it, I guess, if that's the right word for it. There are times where I do, knowing the things I know about some of these cases, I feel like they actually hold back. And I think they may be doing that for legal reasons, like certain things where if you can't definitively prove it, you don't want to be accused of slander. So there are certain things where I think, I'll be watching it with my wife and I'll go, well, I'm surprised they didn't mention this or that other thing. Like, it's pretty damning stuff. And I think it's just because they don't want to get in trouble. But I mean, it's pretty thorough, and it's the kind of show, like, even 10 years ago, you couldn't even ever have imagined would be on television. So, I think it's a pretty good show, honestly. I think some of the episodes are weightier than others. Like, I think you can't really put, the Chris Benoit story on the same level as like the Brawl for All. It's sort of like, well, who cares if Bart Gunn knocked out Dr. Death Steve Williams? It seems a lot less important. But for the most part, it's a good show. I like it.
Also, as someone involved in film, there's only so much you could do in, let's say, 42 to 45 minutes, whatever the running time is. It's not a full-length, documentary film, so they do have limitations. What bothers me is, for example, you mentioned Bart Gunn. They put a certain spin on it. WWE screwed him over, and he left, the WWE, and that was that. And he went on to Japan and had a very successful career, partially based on, him knocking out Steve Williams. So,
yeah, it all depends on who they talk to, as you know. Like, that's how the story gets written. It really depends on who's doing the talking, how things get spun, and depending on the people they're relying on. So.
But as the documentarians, it's still up to them to decide, how are we covering this? Even with Dino Bravo, it was kind of like he ate crow and went to WWE as a last resort. And meanwhile, he had been there prior as a face, and he was getting a decent pushback then. So, it is a take, and it may not be 100% accurate.
Yeah, they did leave out that he had worked there before, but I do believe that when he did go back there in the late 80s, that it really wasn't something that he wanted to do. He kind of did it because he felt he had no choice. He was, that's when all the territories were dying, and he really was his. If he wanted to keep working as a wrestler, it's kind of what he needed to do. That, at least the way I understand it.
Yeah, all in all, I enjoy it also. I have pretty much the same reaction you do. Some episodes are stronger, but for the most part, I think they do a good job.
I thought the Bruiser Brody one was the best one in season one. And so far, I think the Benoit one, I mean, needless to say, I mean, that was almost kind of hard to watch for me, because I'm not going to say I was these people's greatest friend or whatever, but I'm watching it, and I personally knew these people. I had eaten with these people. I had long conversations with all of them, Chris, Nancy, and Daniel. I knew. I had seen. And so it's a very personal thing. I had a long conversation on the phone once with Nancy, which is ironically the only interview I've ever done that I didn't record because my recorder wasn't working.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I had to do it old school and just jot down all the notes while we're on the phone. But she talked at length about how much Chris loved them, how much he loved Daniel, how Daniel looked up to him and all idolized him. I mean, we talked for over an hour, and I'm one of those people, you hear these people, and it's true. He's the last person you would have ever thought would do something like that. Like somebody even said it in the episode, I think Jericho or somebody, and it's kind of true. There are some messed up people in that business where if you said, "Oh, this guy killed his wife and kid and you'd go, "Oh, yeah, I could kind of see that." Yeah. But he was not one of those people at all. All he ever used to talk about was, "I can't wait to go home. I miss my family. I'm only doing this for the money, and I'm done with this, and I love my son." And you just never would have imagined. Like Daniel had all of his dad's action figures. He used to imitate all of his moves. Nancy told me he used to get up on the dresser and he would do the swan dive headbutt onto his bed to try to copy his dad. And so to imagine something like that happening is just literally unthinkable. So that was kind of a rough one. I almost had to turn it off. It was not enjoyable,
So how has this affected you personally? Because I tell Buddy every week, I have a love-hate relationship with wrestling. I've buried too many friends. I've heard too many horror stories, too many rip-offs. I love and hate pro wrestling. How has this affected you?
You mean having worked there and seeing all that stuff?
Yeah, just, knowing a lot of these guys who did not end well, plural.
Yeah, I think love-hate is the best way to describe it. I don't know. I feel like a mark when I say to people, it's in my blood and I can't get rid of it, because I feel like the powers that be in the business rely on people that have that attitude to keep it going, and they take advantage of people like that. They definitely do, and they did to me. But, so I'm a little more wide-eyed and open-eyed about it than, let's say, when I first went to work there 20 years ago. I mean, I always say that working there cured me of being a fan. Now, I don't know. That's not really 100% true because I did go back to it. But, I mean, I stopped watching the product, I want to say, about 2 or 3 years into working there. The only time I would watch it would be in the office just to keep up for the purposes of my job. But, I mean, watching it at home, I had stopped completely. And I didn't start up again until years after I left there because my kids were getting into it. And also because I was working on Pro Wrestling FAQ. And I kind of got pulled back in and working on PWI and everything. It's sort of required of me now. So it is love-hate. Like, I do see through the fantasy of it. I see through the BS of it. I don't know if this is an R-rated show or not, but I see through the BS.
Yeah, you can curse, whatever.
The bullshit.
Yeah.
So, when people watch wrestling with me, you either enjoy it or you hate it, because I will sit there and kind of dissect everything I'm watching and talk about, who screwed who and who did what to who, and this guy's a scumbag and this and that and the other thing. Like, I do that kind of thing. But it's weird. I was once interviewed actually by CNN for a wrestling kind of expose they were doing. And the guy at the end of the interview, where I was burying all this stuff and talking about, I think it was about the Benoit thing and all these horrible things. at the end of it, he said to me, so if they called you to work, go back there to work, would you do it? And I said, in a New York minute. And it's true. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to lie and tell you that I would. I would. And I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah.
Would. I just would. That's just the way it is.
How do you feel about the state of the WWE right now? Looking from the outside, being from the inside, you're the first person that I've ever talked to that's actually worked for the WWE. So direct, in the back office. So I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are between what just happened with the mass firings and the closing of the XFL, but then the fact that Vince was able to get the WWE personnel to be listed as essential employees, and then putting on shows, like WrestleMania without a live audience.
Yeah, so I know the way that business works. Obviously, I'm not in a fantasy land, and I know that these companies are in business to make money. But at this time, with things that have been happening, it just seems like kind of a cold-hearted move to let all those people go. I think when we all know that they have the money to keep them on, they could keep them on if they really wanted to. And part of the reason they're letting them go is clearly, although, I don't think enough has been made of this, but it's clearly because of their XFL losses. Just like what happened 20 years ago now, when I was there when that happened, they let go about 7% of their entire workforce in one day after the XFL and the WWF restaurant folded, and they lost like a lot of money, like many, many millions of dollars. And, it's one of these things. It's like you're gambling with people's livelihoods when you take on these cockamamie, ventures that everyone knows are going to fail. And you're gambling with people's lives and futures. And look, I'm one of those commie, liberal, pinko people that I'm always going to be in favor of the worker. And you got to take care of your workers. I think, look, it's the way of the corporate world, and I've been the brunt of that myself, and it's not going to change. But it doesn't mean that it's the decent thing to do. It's just not. I just thought morally it was not the right thing to do.
Well, what was the feeling like at Titan Tower when you kind of knew that these ventures had failed, and you were still working there? What was the scuttlebutt? How did people act there, knowing that maybe their jobs were in jeopardy, maybe that things were going to end not so positively? How did that feel like to be in Titan Tower when all that was going on?
There was panic. It's not an exaggeration to say there was panic. When I was there for 7 years, and every year around review time, people would go, okay, I wonder if I'm going to make this cut. Am I going to survive this? It would always be a thing of when they did their annual reviews, who would make it, who didn't. And when they lost all that money, it really was this fear and terror, like how many people are they letting go? And on the day it happened, I think we called it like Black Monday or something in there. Everyone, they announced over the PA system in Titan Tower, nobody leave your desk. Everybody stay at your workspace. Do not leave. Because they wanted the facilities guys to be able to find everybody very easily and escort them out of the building without having to track people down. And so we all sat at our desks in terror, waiting for these guys to come around with hand trucks and cardboard boxes and everything. And, I was very lucky. The department that I was in was the publications department. Our VP, Barry Werner, I will say one thing is that he really did look out for us. And so what they did was they sat down all the VPs. This is Vince and all the higher ups. They didn't tell them who to fire or what to do. They just said, you need to cut X amount of money from your budget. However you do it is up to you. So they would figure out, okay, I have to cut $200,000 from my budget. Well, if I fire these people, that's overhead that's gone. So what most departments were doing was firing all the kind of lower income people, just sweeping them all out in one fell swoop. What Barry did was he basically said, okay, we have this assistant vice president who's making $250,000 a year who does hardly anything. So I'm going to can this guy and save everybody else's job. And that's what he did. And thank God for that.
So, Brian, what about the nepotism when 3 of the top 10 salaries at WWE are Stephanie, Triple H, and Shane? And I go, well, if one of them took a nice pay cut, maybe they could have saved a dozen guys like Drake Maverick who were literally crying.
Yes.
And, it was heartbreaking watching this guy. It was like they swept the rug out from under him. And none of his fault. The guy's a great performer.
Yeah, I mean, they've been kind of double dipping for a long time now. People that know the financials of how the talent is paid and everything. I think Dave Meltzer was one of the first people to expose this. So, like, anybody that performs on television gets a talent contract, even if you are an executive in the company. So you can effectively double dip. So by being on-screen performers, Shane and Stephanie and Vince and everybody, they're able to give themselves a second paycheck. So they get paid as corporate employees and they get paid as on-air talent. And that's a loophole that, they have benefited by. They don't have to do that. They absolutely certainly do not have to do that. But they do it. And again, like, who's to stop them? It's just, it's capitalism,
But why do fans, who a lot of whom are hardworking, quote unquote regular folk, why do they endorse nepotism and corporate ruthlessness? I don't get it.
I have a theory about that, and it also comes from working there. They have trained fans to think that way. They really have, in these subtle ways over the years. They've trained the fans to be very pro-corporate, very pro-company. So there's this attitude, and you'll see it a lot when you watch the show, of it seems like you're praising and honoring the talent, but you're really not. It's kind of this backhanded thing where they'll say, oh, these men and women are sacrificing their bodies for your entertainment. But the flip side of that is, it's almost like, as a fan, you feel entitled to that. That if they aren't doing that, they're not living up to what they're supposed to be doing. So, like, for example, when CM Punk did what he did, I think, like, what is it now? God, almost 7 years ago, whatever it was. And he stood up for himself and said, I'm being treated like garbage here. I'm not getting a fair shake. I'm going to look out for myself. I'm walking out. Everybody turned on him. The fans turned on him. And it's because that's what the company wanted them to do. And I was over here going, good for him. There's more guys that should be doing that. Yeah. Because if you're not looking out for your own interest in that business, no one else is going to. He was smart. He looked out for himself. But because of that training where they teach you, like, these people are here to sacrifice their bodies for your entertainment, any guy that stands up for themselves is a whiner, he's a complainer, he's a diva. This is why you won't have a union in that business, because of that attitude.
I saw Roman Reigns, who had cancer twice, say,
one.
I don't want to work in the middle of this COVID pandemic, and fans turned on him. I'm like, that's insane.
Yeah, and or the guys that wouldn't go to Saudi Arabia, like Cena and Daniel Bryan, and they were being seen as not team players and that kind of thing. It's tough. It's like, as fans, like you said, so many of those fans are working class people, and it's strange that although I guess in this country it's not so strange, not to get political, but that they would go against their own interests. It's sort of the story of America in a way. It's not that surprising.
More importantly, tell us about Godzilla, right, buddy?
Yes, it's time for horror. It's time to talk about horror, because the wrestling business gets to be a horror show in itself. Let's talk about some intentional horror rather than unintentional horror. But I have 3 claims to fame in my own horror career, and that is, one is that I happened to meet Paul Stanley once, the guy who ran Creature Features in San Francisco. I was able to get the signature of Ray Harryhausen before he died. Nice. And so I did manage to meet Ray Harryhausen. But maybe most importantly is I'm a high school classmate and close friend of Mark Satrakian. So I hope that name rings a bell with you.
It does ring a bell. It does, but I'm having a hard time figuring out why.
Mark is the modeler and the robotics expert behind about 3/4 of the big science fiction films out there. He did The Head of Howard the Duck, which he doesn't brag about, but he also did Mighty Joe Young and Hellboy and Men in Black, and he does all sorts of special effects modeling and stuff like that. I'm sure you've seen his work over time. So
Yeah, I think he worked for the Stan Winston studio, didn't he? I think that
yeah,
was.
he did. Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
Everybody comes to him now. He's the person. If you want a good-looking robot, you call Mark Satrakian and see what he has to say. My little story about him is that the thing nobody knows about him is he's colorblind, and so things that are very bright colors all look the same to him. So one time in high school, he brought a submarine to class that he had put together, and it was a bright pink. And I said, "Oh, that's great! You did a submarine from the submarine from Operation Petticoat." He said, "No, I didn't." And I said, "Well, but it's a bright pink." He said, "Oh my God, I ran out of Battleship Gray, and I had 2 unlabeled bottles, and they were both they looked to me like the same color. So I painted this thing pink." And he didn't even realize it until, like I said, "Oh, that's a great pink submarine you just made." So there's one thing that probably nobody knows about Mark Satrakian is that he's technically colorblind. But that's why he does everything in black and gray, because he knows he'll always have the color right.
Talk about overcoming a handicap. I mean, God, if you can do that, it's like a one-handed pitcher or something. That's pretty incredible.
Well, the guy is amazing. He would make bats out of tissue paper and chicken wire that would I thought that he captured a bat in his backyard. He would just bring it to school to ceramics class. And then one time in ceramics class, he made a fake finger and filled it with blood, and he pretended to stab his finger while he was cutting the clay up. And our drunk teacher almost called 911 because she was so scared about it. And so I'm really just a huge fan of horror stuff, and I read about a lot of your stuff from the Vault of Horror that you've done, and some interviews that you've done before this. And I have a lot of questions about what your thoughts are on the horror genre right now, because it's kind of in a different transition than it was, say, even maybe about five to 10 years ago. One of your old interviews I read from 2010, you correctly predicted that The Walking Dead would be a huge success. I don't know if you remember that. So you were.
I do.
But you were also talking a lot about how you were anticipating the Wolfman movie coming out.
I'm right about everything.
Yeah.
But I wanted to talk to you about the Wolfman because I saw it too. Why do you think the Wolfman was such a failure? Because it was an attempt for Universal to try to bring back that gothic horror concept, and it totally fell apart.
Well, Universal has now failed so many times in every attempt they've been making to reinvent these original, 1930s and 40s monsters that they did. And it's for a variety of reasons. I mean, the recent Dracula and Mummy things they did have been so incredibly wrong-headed and just from the start. I think the Wolfman, it really had a good chance. The problem was there were way too many cooks in the kitchen. So if you know anything about the production of that movie, it was actually in limbo for a couple of years. It took forever to come out. And there was so many changes made, and they added the whole subplot of where his father is also a werewolf. So you have the Anthony Hopkins, Claude Rains character, who is now a werewolf. The only reason being so they could have this giant werewolf special effects fight at the end. That was really it. I think also they had Rick Baker involved doing this incredible makeup, practical effects, and then the studio execs got nervous and they said, "Screw it, we're going to cover it all up with CGI." There was so many misfires, and honestly, it's a miracle that it's as good as it is. I mean, I think there's a lot of good things about it. I don't think it's that bad, but it just was not a success. I don't know. I saw it in the theater. I thought it was okay, but it didn't set the world on fire. Walking Dead, however, I think is going to basically never end. I think just play until the end of time.
Well, its ratings are beginning to fall a little bit. So I think, but it's tough because they, like Lost, they don't really have an ending in mind, so to speak, because the comic still is going on.
Yeah, I think the comic may have recently ended. I'm not sure about that, but I think the wrong turn they made was, I think, big time, was And this is for those that don't watch the show. I mean, they may not be aware, but when they introduced Negan, and Negan killed off two major characters in a brutal way, one of them being Glenn, who was beloved, who was there from the beginning of the show. I really think that it freaked out a lot of people. That episode was highly disturbing, and the way they depicted it and everything. And I think it drove people away. I think you can point to that period, which I think is like about 3 seasons ago now. That's when the ratings started to nosedive, of people just going, the hell with this. I'm not investing in this anymore. Like, the show is sadistic. And that's kind of what happened with other shows like Lost, where I gave up on Lost when I realized they didn't plan on answering a single question. Like, once I realized they actually have no idea what they're doing or how to answer these questions, I checked out. I said, my time is too precious to invest in a show where they have no intention of providing any kind of closure or anything like that. So, I mean, I've been watching The Walking Dead from the beginning, but at this point, it's just out of a force of habit. Like, I just need to see how it all ends. But it's not. It has fallen so far in terms of quality. I mean, they still have great episodes here and there, but it's really fallen far.
Brian, I have some pressing Godzilla questions that have weighed on me for decades.
Right.
I remember in the 70s, in one movie, Godzilla was doing kung fu. I want to know who taught him. And also, I remember him having a little baby. I want to know whose mom.
Gadzuki.
How did that all happen?
That is a big mystery. That's a big controversy.
Oh, okay.
Where did Minya, who is the baby Godzilla from the 60s and 70s, where did he come from? In the movie, I think they didn't want people to think that Godzilla had sex. So in the movie, when he first appears, which is Son of Godzilla, who at that point, it's supposed to be male. I mean, I think I'm assuming that. So he finds the egg. He doesn't. It's not indicated where it came from, who laid it, there's just an egg, and it hatches and the baby comes out. So it's this very ambiguous. It's just like how Donald Duck didn't have sons, he had nephews, So you wouldn't picture Donald and Daisy having sex, or like things like Popeye had the nephews. They always have nephews. They never have children. So
I have one last Godzilla question before I pass it back to Buddy.
Sure.
So in the early movies, he's the heel. He's stepping on Tokyo. He's killing people. How did he turn face? How did that work? Yeah.
Godzilla was the original tweener. He basically would go
big
back
show
and forth.
Before the big show.
He was the Mark Henry of his day.
Yeah.
But I think that was very political, actually. It was almost a social decision. So in the early films, the first 3 or 4 films, Godzilla is the heel.
Yeah.
A lot of people have posited that Godzilla represents the United States. Godzilla represents the atom bomb. And so Japan, coming out of the occupation, was very bitter and resentful towards America, but they couldn't really show it outwardly because now they were supposed to be our friends, our pals, and everything was all patched up. So it was almost like this subversive way to cast America as the bad guy. But I think when you get into the 60s and the relationship actually really does become very amicable, and Japan does no longer sees the United States as an enemy or anything like that, Godzilla becomes the babyface. Godzilla becomes the protector. But then it happens again later, though, when Godzilla came back in the 80s, right? Now, you've got the 80s. This is the era when the Japanese are now overtaking us in a lot of ways, technology, economically. They're becoming a powerhouse. And so once again, the United States is seen as a rival. And what happens? Godzilla turns heel again.
Yeah.
So in those 80s and 90s Godzilla movies, he's a heel again.
He's like Sergeant Slaughter. Yeah.
Yes, you can draw that parallel of Godzilla being the United States in a way.
Wow.
But if you look at, like, say, the Godzilla films that have come out of recent, they're all pretty bad. And maybe the best Godzilla film that I've seen in the last 20 years was named Cloverfield.
So now, but you have to specify, are you talking about the American-made Godzilla movies they're doing now, or are you talking about the Japanese ones?
No, I've seen some of the Japanese ones, too, but the American ones have been really awful. But even the latest one, The King of the Monsters, that came out recently,
I actually enjoyed that a lot. I have to say, I did. And I don't always go in for the huge special effects extravaganzas, but I felt like that movie, it's the closest thing you can come to Hollywood making a Japanese style Godzilla movie with an 80, 100 billion, trillion dollar budget. It had that same feel to it where Godzilla is this force of nature, and you have the monsters fighting each other, and you have the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. I felt like I had a lot of fun with that movie, a lot more fun than I had, let's say, with the 90s one with Matthew Broderick, which was unwatchable.
I waited online to see that movie, so I'm extra bitter about that one too. But to me, like, you take a movie like Cloverfield, that's more of a Godzilla movie, the way a modern Godzilla movie should be made, than any of the Godzilla movies they've made, other than maybe King of the Monsters. That it had some level of actual suspense to it because you didn't see the monster right away, as opposed to like now where the reveal is done absolutely right away and there's no real suspense. You're just waiting to see Godzilla stomp on certain things.
So Cloverfield was great because there's a whole subgenre in horror now called found footage movies, where the movie is built around the pretense that, oh, we found this real footage on a video recorder that somebody took, or there's security camera footage. Paranormal Activity is like that, and it gives it this authentic feel, like, oh my God, this is really happening. Blair Witch Project was one of the first ones that did that, but Cloverfield was like that. It was a kaiju movie, a giant monster film that was found footage, that was like POV. It wasn't from this omniscient point of view. It was from the point of view of the people in the city. Like, what would they see if this was going on? And honestly, they wouldn't see a lot of the monster at all. They would see buildings falling, they would see things on fire, and they might catch a glimpse of it here and there over the skyscrapers, but that would be about it. So it was a great idea. It was well done. It was a well done.
That made it genuinely scary. One thing I was going to talk to you about too is that do you feel that one of the problems with monster movies these days is that nobody is planning a single monster movie? They want to make a franchise out of it before they've ever seen if the first movie is any good. That in the 50s and the 60s, a lot of the monster movies that eventually got sequels were still just planned to be solo pictures themselves. And then because they were popular, they would make a sequel to it. They didn't plan a franchise, so to speak, around one monster and then, say, okay, well, we're going to have a prequel guaranteed. So we're going to, talk about everything. We're going to explain it all really in the next movie. Because this movie, we're just going to drop you right in the middle of the action and hope that it's a huge success. Like, for instance, I feel like that's like The Mummy was supposed to be part of a franchise with Tom Cruise, the recent one.
It was.
And you could just tell that they were just sort of setting it up so that they could, sell a lot of it and just continue to keep the franchise going when there wasn't a great movie to start with in the first place. Maybe you make a better first movie and not plan to, make two other really good ones after that, the first one being mediocre because you've got things you want to talk about in the other movies. You think that's a problem?
I do. And, it's sort of like the conventional wisdom used to be that a movie should stand on its own. And so a sequel or any kind of movie that's part of a series needs to be completely self-standing. Can I enjoy this movie by itself? But that is now out the window completely. Like, if you look at the Marvel films or Star Wars and things like that and Harry Potter, for the most part, you can't. Those movies do not stand on their own, and they're not meant to stand on their own. They're meant to be enjoyed as like this vast movement of films, and so it's a whole different ball game now, and it does backfire a lot of times, like with Universal, where like the monsters, where you're gambling on something and then it doesn't really work out. The studios nowadays are looking to stay afloat because of those franchises. Like, that's where they put all their money, because that's what's going to keep them in business. So they are all about just milking it and milking it and milking it forever.
Because I'm interested in that, because every generation has its Frankenstein movie, but we have not had a Frankenstein movie in 30 years. There hasn't been one. It's interesting to see, like, of all the franchises that they keep going back to, they don't want to go back to the Frankenstein concept. They dance around it and they won't go back to it.
I guess the last major one, right, was the Robert De Niro, Kenneth Branagh one from, like, what, 25 years ago, which I didn't even think was that great either. I thought that was vastly overrated, kind of a mess of a movie.
Frankenstein was too smart. He was too smart for his own good.
Well, honestly, I thought he wasn't smart enough because they were going for, look, I give them credit. They wanted to do something that was more faithful to the original novel, where the monster is actually highly intelligent, highly eloquent. And so the horror comes from the fact of this very intelligent, articulate being who's being treated like a monster when he's really not a monster. But I felt like they didn't go far enough with it, where they almost hedged their bets. And they thought, like, well, if the monster starts, quoting Shakespeare, people are going to walk out of the theater. So they had him be kind of intelligent, but not too intelligent. And, it was sort of like muddy somewhere in the middle. They didn't really know what they wanted to be. I thought I loved De Niro, thought he was incredibly miscast, like comically miscast in that movie. And Kenneth Branagh, again, I enjoy some of his film. I think his Shakespeare adaptations are great. He is one of the hammiest over actors, I think, who has ever lived. And in that movie, he was just chewing the scenery beyond belief. So that movie was a big disappointment. And I liked the Bram Stoker Dracula that Francis Ford Coppola did. I thought that those two movies could complement each other, but boy, they were, in my opinion, very far apart in quality.
And Brian, before we run out of time, I just wanted to broach this. I was watching Kenny Casanova's COVID Con this morning, and they had one interesting historian and writer and wrestler after another. They have 60 guests over 2 days. And it was interesting listening to the writers and the publishers. And since we have you, I just wanted to put this out there. They're talking about research, and I love microfiche and results and data, and it was barely mentioned, writing. I was a writing major. I'm an English teacher besides doing various other things. And, I grew up on Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, et cetera, so on. And how important is actual writing in quote unquote wrestling journalism? Because to me, it's always, let's move people, let's touch people, not a bombardment of dates and facts.
Right. Well, I have two things to say about that because I've come against it too. So on one side, I do say a lot of times there's not enough of an emphasis on the quality of the writing, which I have tried to work to my advantage because I'm also an English major. I'm also, a teacher and all this, and English literature is my love. So I've tried to kind of blend this obsessive wrestling research that I like to do with actual competent prose, that people would want to read. There are people out there that have done that. I mean, there's wrestling books that I've enjoyed. There's a book that I did that I've read while I was researching the Sheik book called Drawing Heat by Jim Friedman, and it's all about wrestling in Toronto in the 80s, which kind of bordered on the Sheik's territory. And it was written, the guy was a journalist, and you can tell it's written beautifully, just beautifully. And there are others like that too. But on the other side, it is important. I mean, you have to do your research. It is very important, especially in a business like wrestling that didn't do a great job of preserving its history. I do get it. I understand why that's important. However, I've also had the experience of, when I was doing Pro Wrestling FAQ, and I don't want to name names, but, there was a very respected wrestling historian who's no longer with us, who I crossed paths with, and I was dying to talk to and pick his brain and everything. And he turned out to be a completely arrogant prick. And the reason was all he cared about was facts and figures. And I was trying to get his opinions on things. And he thought I was out of my mind. Like, why are you asking me the purpose of heels and faces? Like, what are you, an idiot? You know why there's heels and faces. And I would say, of course I know. But I want your insight as a thinking human being. What's your insight? And this guy could tell you who beat who in Kansas City in 1937, but he had no opinions or ideas about any of it. So we wound up walking away from each other, both thinking the other person was an asshole, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it was very disillusioning because he was a guy that was very beloved and well respected, but I just had a very bad experience. And I think that happens a lot where you get people that are so caught up in the facts and figures, they forget you're also trying to tell a story. Like, I'm in the process, I'm trying to do that now with Chic, where I'm coming to the end of my research phase. And I'm thinking, before I start writing and just sit down and start typing away, what is the theme of this book? What is the story I'm trying to tell? This is the story of a son of immigrants, who came to America, made something out of nothing, turned the racial prejudice that he faced as a kid into something that he could make money out of. Like it's a story to tell, but you have to have an idea. It can't just be like this happened and then this happened and then this happened and
Exactly.
so that, I'm trying. There's been a lot of great books out there that don't do that. But there are some that do that, and I'm trying to avoid doing that.
Brian, we put 6 years into 350 days, thousands of hours of editing. We had about 90 hours in the can, which we honed to an hour 48. And we'll get so-called wrestling journalists and historians go, I knew all that from my shoot interviews, and I'm like, but that wasn't the point of the movie. Right. It's not a bombardment of information. I said to the editor, make a movie that will make an 80-year-old woman cry who's never watched wrestling. I said, that's the movie I want to see, not a bombardment of information.
And I've come across that too, where people go like, oh, there's nothing in this book that I didn't already know. And I think to myself, okay, the other part of that is, great, good for you. You know everything about wrestling. You're amazing. I'm going to send you a trophy in the mail. But here's the other thing. You also have to understand, not everybody knows all the shit that you know. There's a lot of people out there that don't know these things that are common knowledge to you. And I want a book that's accessible to everyone. That's what I did with Pro Wrestling FAQ. I wanted it to be a book that simultaneously is an awesome reference book for people that love wrestling facts and know it all, but they want to refer to it, down to people that know nothing about it and they want to learn about it. It's the same with the Chic book. I'm thinking of longtime fans that love the Chic and want to reminisce, but I'm also thinking of people that go like, I don't get it. Like, who was this guy? I never heard of him. I'm writing the book for them too.
Yeah. And then you have the guys who will go, well, the Chic and Bruno and Nikolai, etc., so on, they weren't great workers, and they don't get it whatsoever. The charisma, the aura, the psychology,
Yes, I had again, I'm going to name drop and whatever. I'm sorry for doing that, but I had a conversation with Hulk Hogan once where I got a chance to ride in a limo with him and just pick his brain. It was this crazy experience. And he told me something I never forgot, because he's another guy that catches a lot of garbage too for how he worked. He would go to me, you know what? Here's the reality. He said, a guy like Rey Mysterio or Chris Benoit or Eddie Guerrero, they can go out there and they could fly and jump all over the place and do somersaults and cartwheels and 800 wrestling holds, and the crowd goes wild. And he said, you know what? I go like this. And the crowd has the same exact reaction. So we are all working in different ways. We're getting to it in different ways. He said, I can't do what those guys do, but they can't do what I do. And I thought there was a lot of truth to that. There's not just one way of working.
Yeah. Buddy?
Yeah, no, I think that's really a great comprehensive look at what you're trying to bring forward with the book. I think that there's a lot of people that really don't know how the Sheik is pretty much the father of hardcore wrestling. A lot of people think that all came about in ECW days, but he was doing all that crazy stuff with, foreign objects. I'd never heard of a wrestler using a foreign object until I'd seen the Sheik do his stuff.
Fire.
Yeah, fire and all that stuff. He really brought it to a different level. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that sort of history. They look at, stuff in kind of a vacuum, and they don't really realize how we wouldn't be here with wrestling today if it wasn't for people like the Sheik taking the kind of risks that he took and taking wrestling to a different level. So I don't know if you ever saw the movie I Like to Hurt People.
Of course, yes.
Yeah, so that's the one. That's my frame of reference with the Sheik, because I'm a little on the younger side like you, and I didn't get to see his matches, when they were shown. And the WWE drops the ball when it comes to showing that kind of history and those kind of you'll never see an Ivan Koloff match on the WWE network, and you're never going to see the Sheik do a lot of stuff, and you're never going to see Bobo Brazil or Pompero Firmo, and so that if it wasn't for someone like you taking the effort to bring that up and to remind us of this sort of history, it probably would get lost. So I'm really impressed that you're able to do that.
Well, thank you. I mean, WWE, to their credit, they do have some great things on the network that fans that I wouldn't have dreamed as a fan I'd get to watch, a lot of older wrestling. But, there are major gaps. There's huge gaps in what they show and what they have access to. And also, it's sort of like they have now written the history of wrestling. And so if you're not in their version of it, fans don't know about you. And it's true. Sheik did, the stuff he did was definitely not as completely insane as what you would see in ECW, but it definitely, you could draw a line from one thing to the other. Like, he was one of the first guys to regularly brawl outside the ring, just go crazy, just leave the ring, go into the stands, throwing chairs, to the point where a lot of promoters didn't know what to make of it or what to do with him. But because he always drew money, it was like they were forced to work with him. So you had some of these old school wrestling promoters like Sam Muchnick in St. Louis, who was trying to present wrestling like it was a sport, very sports-like. And they would go, oh my God, I don't like this is garbage, but it draws money, so what am I going to do? The Sheik went to St. Louis and worked a match, I think, with Pat O'Connor, it's the ultimate scientific wrestler. Yeah. And he just went nuts, throwing things, stabbing him, running outside the ring, and they basically told him, don't ever come back here. We don't ever want to come back here, because that's not what we promote as wrestling. But he's one of those guys where you go, well, what really is wrestling? A lot of times wrestling is not wrestling. Wrestling is a lot of other things that they do.
Brian, I must ask this one question because it's bothered me forever. I would see lists that are made in WWE, for example, the 50 greatest heels DVD or whatever, and they'll have Killer Kowalski number 49 or 50, and I'm like, did the guy who wrote the list, was he 12 years old, or were the politics? I mean, where did they come up with this kind of stuff?
I know. I think we've crossed paths that way online too a lot of the time, where I'll troll the comments on these lists just going greatest managers of all time, really? Where's Wild Red Berry? Where's Bobby Davis? Where are these people that managed before 1985, And I think it is one of those things where wrestling is so weird, because if it was baseball or boxing, you would never have somebody go, oh, I'm going to write an article about the greatest heavyweight boxing champions of all time, but only since 1985.
Yeah.
I'm not going to have Muhammad Ali or Joe Louis or Jack Dempsey, but with wrestling, it's almost like that's accepted. It's just you're not criticized for not knowing anything from before you started watching wrestling, which I think is really wrong, because especially, if you're a fan, you don't have to be obsessed with the history. But if you're somebody that's putting yourself out there as a historian and you're making a list like that, do your homework, do your homework and find out who are really considered the greatest from the beginning, the whole package, not just what you know about.
So it's not politics. It's just somebody having a basic lack of knowledge.
I think that's it. It's just, I'm going to write about what I know, and if it's before my time, then it probably wasn't that important. That's an attitude that's prevalent among wrestling fans, unfortunately.
Okay.
Not to play ping pong with you and make you go back and forth, but I want to get you back on the horror thing again, and I wanted to find out. What are you looking forward to horror-wise that's coming up or science fiction-wise in maybe the next year? Is there anything that you're looking at or looking forward to?
Well, I know. I mean, I can tell you what I'm into right now. There's a Netflix series talking about Dracula. There is a Netflix series of Dracula, which I think was originally done by the BBC, and they brought it over, which is fascinating. And it's a completely fresh and different take on the Dracula mythos. they kind of it uses the book as a starting point, but then the story just goes somewhere completely different. It's really well done. I'm enjoying the heck out of it. That's a good one. There's a great vampire comedy series that FX has called What We Do in the Shadows that my wife and I are nuts over. It's sort of like if you took vampires but made it like The Office. That's what the show is. That's
the movie.
Yeah, the movie's great. I'm one of those people that I like the TV show even more. I think I'm in the minority, but
I haven't seen it yet.
More. So I mean, those are two things. Also, the guy, I'm drawing a blank now. The guy who did Get Out and who did Us, who is incredible. What's his name?
Jordan Peele.
Yeah, Jordan Peele. Right. He's got another project coming up, which of course the name escapes me, but that I'm very much looking forward to because he's somebody that has a great. He's a great filmmaker. He's a visionary, and he's not ashamed to do horror movies, to focus on horror. So I mean, anything he does, I'm looking forward to checking out. I mean,
King Kong versus Godzilla coming up that you're gonna pass.
I'm not gonna. Well, it's funny. I don't consider that horror, although I guess you said sci-fi and horror too. But yeah, I mean, I am interested in seeing it, especially because I know it's gonna spike my book royalties. But I am. I think like I'm kind of a fan of the older school movies, honestly. So like I love the original King Kong versus Godzilla and from the 60s, and I just know that it's not going to live up to that. It's just going to be a very different kind of movie. I actually loved Kong Skull Island a lot, the one that Samuel L. Jackson was in, which is sort of like a prequel to all this stuff where they find Godzilla in the 70s in the South Pacific or wherever they are. I thought that was really well done. So, I mean, it could turn out to be a lot of fun, I hope. But still, no one to this day has explained how this is a fair fight when King Kong is 50 feet tall and Godzilla is about 400 feet tall. No one has explained to me how they're mysteriously the same size. But, I guess we can't split hairs. We can't split hairs.
I got to say, this has been an absolutely fascinating interview from the moment you just first started talking to us. It's been great. Why don't you tell the audience how they can get more information about your books and your website and all that?
Yeah, plug anything you like.
Okay. Well, I'll mention a few things then. So I do have a website. It's a bit of a mouthful as a URL, but I'll say it. It's brianrsolomon.wixsite, wixsite.com/author. So I update that a lot with upcoming stuff. You can also find Pro Wrestling FAQ on Facebook. Just search for it. I have a page. And also the Vault of Horror, where all my horror stuff is. There's a page for that on Facebook. I am Brian R. Solomon on Twitter, and I'm Brian Solomon Author on... No, I have that. Yeah. Yes, I'm Brian Solomon Author on Instagram, and I'm Brian R. Solomon on Twitter. Sorry. So there's a lot of places people can find me.
And do you have any upcoming projects that people should be like looking out for? Something that's going to be coming up soon?
Well, I'm excited about there's the WrestleMania winners and losers cover story on the August issue of PWI, which is hitting newsstands, I think, in about a week. Also, there's my upcoming column for PWI, The Lockdown, which starts in the October issue. But of course, Blood and Fire, the Sheik biography, that's the big one for me right now. It will be coming out in 2021. I don't have an exact date yet. A lot of the COVID stuff could be affecting that, so it might get pushed back a little, but I'm going to keep updating. And you know what? I didn't even mention, I have a deal now to do a series of FAQ books after that. So I'm booked for the next 5 or 6 years in terms of writing. I'm going to be...
That is fantastic.
Talk about eclectic. After the Sheik book, I'm doing the Frank Sinatra FAQ, okay? I'm doing the zombie FAQ, and I'm doing superheroes FAQ. So
for the superhero and zombie FAQ, you can give me a call too. I can help fill in some blanks on that myself if you have any questions.
I'm trying to reduce the amount of interviews I do because they are such a pain in the ass transcribing so many interviews. But if I do, I will call you.
You have to do mashups like Frank Sinatra versus Godzilla, zombies versus
Superman,
Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack. Yeah, just toss it all together.
Sure. Yeah. I'll give it some thought.
This has been a really great interview. I would love to have you back on the show when you're ready to promote your book's finalized and you're ready to get it promoted. But if you ever want to come back and chat with us again, this was really enjoyable. And I really want to thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's fun to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
All right. We'll see you all next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye now.